So I'm wishing everybody Chag Sameach. It is a Chag. It's Yom Ha'atzmaut. It's Israel's 73rd birthday.
Mm.
They've been celebrating already for more than 12 hours. Um, the What I thought we would do is a few, just a few readings to remind us of our historical Judaic connection in a religious sense to the land and the state of Israel. Then I'll try to give you a summary, an analysis, and a little bit of forecasting, which is extremely difficult, about the results and the consequences of the last election. And I must throw out the statement that many Israelis are assuming that this will continue to be a stalemate and they're going to head towards election number 5 within 6 months. But anyway, but I'll try to give some time about that, and then come back to finally offering a prayer for the state of Israel, and I would invite you to join me and we'll sing Hatikva. So that would be the plan, and I would begin officially by reminding all of us of these. These are the introductory words to Israel's Declaration of Independence from 1948, and then also go back only about 3,100 years before that to what indeed may be a Declaration of Independence as written by the psalmist, Psalm 122 in the Bible, in the Tanakh. Eretz Yisrael was the birthplace of the Jewish people. After being forcibly exiled from their land, the people remained faithful to it throughout their dispersion, never ceased to pray and hope for their return to it, and for the restoration in it of their political freedom. That's the preface or the opening statement of the Declaration of Independence that was signed on the 5th of ER in the year 5,708, 73 years ago. Like I said, approximately 3,100 years before, in the city of Jerusalem, Shir HaMa'alot LeDavid, this song of ascents, was sung by the priests and the Levites in honor of King David, who had reunited the city. I rejoiced when they said to me, "We are going up to the house of the Eternal. Our feet stood inside your gates, O Jerusalem. Jerusalem built up now, a city knit together. Pray for the well-being of Jerusalem. May those who love you be at peace. May there be well-being within your ramparts, peace in your citadels. For the sake of my kin and my friends, I pray for your well-being. For the sake of the house of the Eternal our God, I seek your good." And I wanted to, in addition to sharing those words, also give an expression as written about the state of Israel by one of the most famous rabbis, not only American rabbis, but worldwide rabbis of the 21st century, and that would be Abraham Joshua Heschel. Heschel wrote, "Israel is a personal challenge, a personal religious issue. It is a call to every one of us as an individual, a call which one cannot answer vicariously. The ultimate meaning of the state of Israel must be seen in terms of the vision of our prophets and psalmists, the redemption of all the world. The religious duty of the Jew is to participate in the process of continuous redemption, in seeing that justice prevails over power, that awareness of God penetrates all human understanding." I think it's a beautiful statement, and to a certain degree, it also reflects the what we would call the hope, the prayer and the hope that Israel will not only be the place of refuge, the place of freedom for Jews from the four corners of the world, but also will be a symbol of redemption and of the ideal of humanity for all the world. So, permit me to give a little bit of first some parliamentary background, and then move to thoughts before, and then as a result of, and then the consequences of the most recent election about a month ago, a little less than a month ago. Israel. Oh, and most of this information is available to anybody who wants to do the research. I mean, I try to read two of the Israeli daily newspapers on a regular basis, but you can certainly find information. And I will admit in advance that much of the, not necessarily the analysis, but much of the interpretation and dealing with, like I said, what the consequences might be, are coming from 3 or 4 sources, all but one of them being in Israel. From David Horowitz, who is a former Brit. He's the editor now of the online newspaper, The Times of Israel, but he formerly worked for the Jerusalem Post, which is the English language Israel newspaper. And then also he and actually a fellow who's a friend of mine, who's originally from Pontiac, Michigan, founded a monthly magazine called the Jerusalem Report. David is now the CEO and the editor of the Times of Israel. So he's one source. Another source is Rabbi Ron Kronish, who's American-born, but has lived in Israel since the 1970s. And he is I would say the most recognized spokesman for the interfaith community. He's a rabbi, but for Jewish, Christian, Muslim interactions, interactivities, interrelationships based in Jerusalem, but also throughout the country. And then the third, I'm looking through my notes. I'm blanking on who I was using as the third. It'll come back to me of who the third was, but the fourth is the one American here is also my friend, and a name that some of you may be familiar with, Rabbi Eric Yoffe, who's the president emeritus of the North American Reform Movement. But Eric also has sat on the executive board of the World Zionist Organization, of the Jewish Agency for Israel, and he continues to be a very, very pro-Zionist, although he certainly is on the center left of the perspective of the looking at the Israeli governmental and political scene. Okay, so 1 or 2 sentences to remind us of how Israel's government works. It is totally different from our system. On one hand, Israel only has what they call a unicameral, a one-house legal governmental system. The parliament, the Knesset, they don't have a House of Representatives and a Senate. They only have the one parliament with 120 seats. There's also a Supreme Court. And the president does not really exert much executive power. He's much more of a figurehead. So the Knesset, or the parliament, is what's most important. And another difference in the way that between the way that we vote here and in most democratic countries, not all, but most democratic countries with which we're familiar, is that the parliament, the members of the parliament, Chavrei Knesset in Hebrew, are not responsible to a particular constituency. They run on their own. They have no particular geographic alignment. In other words, it would be conceivable that all 120 members of the Knesset could be residents of the city of Jerusalem, or 120 of them could not live in Jerusalem. There's no geographic representation. Their allegiance is to the party and to the platforms or the positions specifically of the party, or to themselves only and their own policy development, their own positions, if you will. When those are the first two differences. The third difference relates to the individual Israeli citizen who's voting, and that is that when you walk into the election booth, you're presented with a very, very long ballot. Many people can indeed just vote for a party, of which there are many. There are about 20 different parties in the state of Israel. I think there were 19 officially in the last election. And you get to be on the ballot just by having a certain number of petitions, but again, signatures on petitions. But again, the party is not necessarily related to any particular geography, but it might be a religious party. It might be a religious party that even denies the existence of the state of Israel and people who don't pay taxes and don't serve in the army. It might be a kibbutz, a party representing all the kibbutzim. It might be a party that represents a communist point of view. It might be an Arab party, of which there were 3 or 4 on the last ballot, if I remember correctly. The parties that represent people, we call them the settlers, those who live in what the media refers to as occupied territory, what Israelis would just talk about as Judah and Samaria, meaning east of the Green Line that was established by and through the UN. There are some particular parties that represent not necessarily only those who live there, but those who believe that there should be Israelis entitled to live there, and whether or not Arabs should be living there as well. You can have different nuances to that. The Reform movement does not have a party. The conservative movement does not have a party. The Orthodox has several parties. There are quite liberal parties. There's like a Peace Now kind of Peaceniks, a party, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The Labor Party, which for many, many years of Israel's history was the most significant party. Nowadays, it would be the Likud, the party of Netanyahu. Labor is making a resurgence. I'll talk about that in a while, and on and on and on. So when you walk into the election booth and you're given your ballot, you see not only the names of the parties, but each party presents 120 candidates. Some people can choose, okay, I am going to vote for the Labor Party, or I'm going to vote for this religious party, the Torah Masorah Party, or United Judaism, or the one of the Arab parties, or the Communist Party, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Some people will do that. They'll put a check mark or an X, whichever it is, or you punch a hole in it. I forget exactly how they do it over there, and hand it in and walk out. Most people will indeed take advantage of the fact that they can vote 120 names. They usually don't put 120. They might put 15 or 20. They might put 14 of those 15 for their particular party with which they feel the most comfortable, but their next door neighbor or their brother-in-law or their cousin or their nephew or niece is also running, and they want to make sure that he or she gets their vote. So rather than voting for the entire party, just at the top of the ballot, they'll pick out 19 or 14 other names or whatever. But an individual citizen can vote for 120, all 120 candidates. Okay, that's the vote. Yes, sir.
Are there candidates that are cross parties? So they're like Mary on different, would appear on different parties?
No, sir. No, sir. No, sir. Your name would be only on one party list. Okay. And the individual parties all have conventions at which they assign the number that is the highest ranking that you are. So Netanyahu obviously is number one on the Likud list, for example. Okay, this new up and coming woman who's very, very popular now on the left at the Labor Party, Merav Michaeli, she's number one on the labor list, etc. Bennett is number one on the Naftali Bennett is number one on the Yamina, which is Hebrew for right wing. On the Yamina list, whatever. So there's a lot of haggling back and forth as to which number you are on the list. And why is that important? That's important because when all the votes are tallied by party, they begin with by party, and the percentage that you have. So let's say that again, I'm talking about the Labor Party, not that I would have voted for them, but we use the Labor Party. So if the Labor Party wins 10% of the entire total of votes, across the entire country, they are then entitled to 10% of the 120. The Labor Party is entitled to their top 12 people on their list automatically go into the parliament. See, if another party, if the Likud party, Netanyahu's party, wins a third, 33.3% of all the votes that are tallied, then 1/3 of the Knesset, the total of 120, meaning 40 votes, 40 members of Knesset would go in, 40 members of Likud would go into the parliament, and they would be the top 40 names on that Likud list. Is the way that they do it. There's just one second, Michael. There's a minimum number. I believe it was 0.5% in this year's election. I don't know, there's some committee that decides, and you had to reach the base number of 0.5% for your party of all of the votes, all the 5 million votes that were tallied. So whoever's good in math, whatever 0.5% of 5 million is, that as long as your party reached that threshold, you would get at least one parliamentarian. Okay, Michael, please.
Yeah, did you mention exactly how many parties altogether?
I think there were 19 in this year's election.
So that sounds kind of based on what we have here in the United States, and you have such a small country. It sounds ridiculous, somewhat ridiculous.
We Jews are known for having a lot of people express lots of different opinions, and that's the real, that's their system. That's their system. But on the other hand, participation was low in last month's election. It was low. 66% of the eligible population voted.
Okay.
And that's low. I don't think the United States has ever even come close to 50% of people, eligible voters, actually participating in a national election. Go ahead,
Uh,
Michael. I cut you off. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. And out of those 19 parties, if you will, are there two parties that would closely represent Republicans and Democrats? In your opinion, that you can see?
I don't know if I would say Republicans and Democrats, but I would certainly say liberal. I would certainly say liberal and conservative.
Liberal.
Again, I don't know if I would use the terms that we use for our two major parties, but they're.
Well, I don't.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mean it exactly like that, but you get my drift.
The two, at least in the last, I guess 15 years, the two. Well, the one major party on the right is the Likud. That's Netanyahu's party, and before that, it was the party of Shamir, and Moshe Aaron's and some others. Certainly the right. That was the major party. Want to call them Republicans? We can call them Republicans, although I don't necessarily think that's accurate or fair, but that was certainly the major party. But having said that, never in Israel's history has any one party been able to accumulate a majority of the parliament of 61 votes in and of itself. Never. When Labor was the more dominant party on the left, I think the most that Labor ever had in and of itself was 51. Okay, so Labor used to be, if we're talking about what are the two most important or the two most popular, it would be Likud and Labor, although Labor has gone down and lots of other small parties have come up. Meretz and Meretz is the one that's like a civil rights party, if you will, and party of the Russian immigrants, for example, and the Kibbutz party, for example, all leaning more towards the left, but not in the sense that we would understand as Democrat. Yes, Lynn, please.
Well,
do the parties form like coalitions?
Yes, that's
like
the process.
And are they more or less permanent coalitions, or are they issue oriented only?
Well, the coalition, the way that coalitions align themselves is the most important factor in trying to understand the Israeli government. Okay, so here's how it plays out. It plays out that after the election, once everything is totaled, okay, and so Likud, which still is as a party, has received the most number of votes, but far from a majority of the Knesset. Okay, so Netanyahu is at the top of his list, and he's getting 50 votes or 49 votes or whatever it is, but he needs to get to 61. He needs to get a majority. So there's all the backroom negotiating and bartering that happens between the leader of the one party, or the most important party, and all these small parties to get up to the number of 61. And what is it that we have to trade? Is it we have to make a commitment about a certain policy, as you're asking, or is it well, okay, if this party comes into the coalition, we'll get, and this is what has been happening, and again, my bias shows through here, but this is what's been happening with the Orthodox, okay, with the Orthodox parties. Okay, if you give us your votes and join the coalition, they say to the Orthodox, you can have total control over all religious matters in the country. Everything will be determined by religious law. Only Orthodox rabbis can officiate at weddings and funerals and and conversions and things like that. The Orthodox parties will have, you'll have the Department of Education. You will determine what the curriculum will be, even in the public schools. You will determine the eligibility of young men to go into the army. And of course, for the Orthodox, the women don't go into the army. And all of those might be trade-offs in order to get to 61. Now, the interesting thing, and I'm kind of jumping way ahead, but for the sake of explanation, the really interesting thing right now is those smaller parties that seem to be most open to making deals to come into the coalition, in addition to the ultra-Orthodox, which we know have always been interested, but you've got the far right, you've got, again, the settlers group, but the settlers group is very firm on saying that no Arabs should live in the West Bank, okay? No Arabs should live in occupied territory, Judea and Samaria. Okay, what we would, we would hear those kinds of things, and we said that's totally racist. How can you allow someone who promotes that kind of a position? How can you allow them into the government? Netanyahu, or whoever's the one who's trying to form the government, said, well, is it, for the sake of all of my policies, for the sake of being able to govern, am I willing to compromise or concede on that particular issue? What's fascinating this year, especially, this has been unknown. There have been small Arab parties in the Knesset, in the parliament, because Arab citizens of Israel can vote, and 1 million of them do. And so they always have several, 3 or 4 or 5 members of the parliament who are Arab, whether they're Christian, whether they're Muslim. This year, there's the head of one of the Arab parties who is being extremely open, says, I'll even work with Netanyahu. It's time to end all of our previous history. 73 years is enough. Let's work together rather than against each other. And so it's interesting to see which of the parties right now, only those on the left, obviously, are willing to consider working a deal with him and his party. Now, the radical Arab side and the radical Muslim parties are obviously negating what this guy says, but he still represents a population of several 100,000 Arabs. He's the leader of their political party, and he's willing to enter into internal, not external, but internal negotiations with the Israeli government. It's a new fascinating thing. I'll probably come back to that. So anyway, after all the numbers are counted, and each of the parties that has reached that threshold, which I believe was 0.5%. So each of the parties, the large parties, the minor parties, the Communist Party, the Arab parties, whatever it might be, each of their head honcho, their top vote getter or whatever, has an appointment with the figurehead president of the state, who right now is Reuven Rivlin. He's finishing out his term. And they have an appointment with the president of the state, and he looks them in the eye and says, who does, out of the major players, who does your party think has the best chance to form a majority government, to get 61 votes in a coalition? I'm not asking if you support that person. I'm asking who do you think has the best chance of making it work? And then after all those discussions, the president is mandated, they don't have a constitution, but it's mandated by their election laws to then say to that person, okay, you have 28 days to try to form a coalition. what was interesting is that Rivlin, of course, as we know, went to Netanyahu based on the conversations that he'd had with the individual parties. He went to Netanyahu and said, all the different parties think that you have the best chance, but I gotta say, I don't think you can do it. So not only do I not think you can do it, he said, I don't think you should be doing it. Netanyahu is under indictment, and whether it's a matter of innocence or guilt, but Rivlin is saying, I don't think that the country should be in the position of trying to decide about its future, its short-term government and its long-term future, at the same time that you're also facing criminal charges. How can you devote all of your time and all of your energy to running the country if you have to be in court, and whatever. Now, of course, Netanyahu wants to go and form his coalition with the small parties that are all saying a sitting prime minister, does this sound familiar? A sitting prime minister cannot be brought to trial. So he's trying to get those parties to quickly sign on, and he's willing to give up God knows what to get those small parties to sign on, get up to the point of 61. He can get on the phone, call the president and said, I've got 61, call for a parliamentary session, and we can vote, and then we will have a government. He's not there yet, but that's one of the curious things that's going on. Rivlin has made it very clear that he would have preferred to hear from all the other parties that someone from one of the smaller, either not for the smaller party necessarily, but it wouldn't have been Labor, but it would have been from the left, that one of those people, there's a guy named Yair Lapid, who it would be the equivalent for us, I suppose, if Walter Cronkite was a candidate. Okay, here's again. I suppose I should come to a more contemporary, more modern name. But here's someone who was on television as a news anchor and a personality for years and years and years, and finally now has gone into politics. He's been doing it for about 5-6 years. He's run before, but he's building up a lot of popular support as a populist. A lot of people think that he would have been able to patch together a coalition, perhaps working with a couple of the parties on the right, but that there was enough closer to the 60 number. There was enough, if not 61, of the anti-Bibi Netanyahu block of parties if they had been invited to work together. But by definition and by mandate, the president can't do that. He has to go only based on what the parties, the leaders of the parties, have told him. If after 28 days Netanyahu cannot come up with a majority of 61 votes, then Rivlin can go to whomever he chooses and ask that person gets 2 to 3 weeks, whatever, to try to form a government. Yeah, Michael, please.
Well, no, I made a mistake.
Okay.
All
right. So
this is
go ahead.
Just a second. This will be funny. And when you mentioned Walter Cronkite, it took me back. It took me back, and I thought, and I was going to say his advertiser, if you remember, was Timex watches, but that's not right. It was Walter Winchell.
Oh, okay. Okay, all right. I just couldn't come up with a name that everybody would
That's okay.
would acknowledge in the present.
But
okay.
I did have one more question before you
sure.
go on, and I don't know if it's going ahead, but you mentioned the Orthodox,
right,
and the people that are studying, both men and women, that keeps them out of the services, the armed services of Israel. And why is that? If you know, why is that exactly?
because the young men should be studying Torah, and the women should be at home having babies and taking care of the house.
Yeah,
So
that
that's
should be
right.
discussed there.
Right,
Anyway,
right. Now, incidentally, and again, this is something that I'll mention again, what the number 4 name on the Labor Party's list this year was a fellow by the name of Gilad Kariv, who is a Reform rabbi. And the Labor list got 7. They won 7 seats in the Knesset. So Gilad is in. He was sworn in the other day. He's now a member of the Knesset. There have been Orthodox rabbis in the Knesset before. There was an imam who was already in the Knesset a number of years ago. But this is the first Reform or liberal rabbi who was in the Knesset. When he came up to the lectern the other day to give his first speech, all of the ultra-Orthodox members of the parliament walked out. At the second speech, he was interrupted literally every 30 seconds.
Uh-oh.
Yep. His internet tends to be unstable.
Oops.
Okay.
Is that Steve on the other line?
Yeah.
Hi, Steve. Hmm.
Okay. Oh, okay, he got off. He'll probably get back in.
Yeah. There you are.
Okay,
Did
you're
I-
back.
You're on
We can't hear you.
You still can't hear me?
No.
very small.
Very, very faint.
Very.
There
Oh,
you
now.
There's my volume. Okay. So did you go off or did I go off?
You went off.
I went off. I was still talking. All right. I'm not sure where I stopped. Where you lost me. So let me go with some of these analyses that I've been able to find. But still, if there are questions, don't hesitate. So I mentioned before Rabbi Ron Kronish, who teaches, coordinates, he does interfaith activities based in Jerusalem. So he wrote this before the election, and I'm summarizing that he said that there are 3 possible scenarios that could occur as a result of the election. He wrote this a few days before the voting, and then we'll look at how they played out. So his first, and he said all 3 scenarios would be. He says there's a bad one, there's a very bad one, and one that's worse. Okay, so he says the bad result would be what actually happened is the inability of any one party to form the next government. Again, that has always been the case in Israel's past. Never have they had a case where one party won a majority, WON, won a majority. Okay, so the question is who's gonna go where? And before the election, the assumption was it was going to go to one of 2 blocks, BLOK, the progressive, or they prefer to be known as the anti-Bibi, anti-Netanyahu block of parties, and then also the pro-Bibi, pro-Netanyahu parties. And then with a lot, those were the two majors, each of which, each block was assumed to achieve about 50 votes. If it went to 52, 53, then we weren't really sure that was leading into who the president would go to try to form the government. So bad scenario was what they assumed was going to happen because it always has happened before in Israel's history. Now, like Michael was asking before, with so many parties, it's, you know, it's really, it's confusion, it's disorienting, and da 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 da. Why can't they just have 2 or 3? Well, because we're Jews. I don't really have the answer to that. Okay, so what Cronish said was the bad scenario is no, actually, okay. So a bad scenario would be status quo, if you will. A worse scenario would be actually from his point of view. His point of view being the, I don't want to say liberal, but being from the most representative of the entire Israeli society, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, whatever. The worst scenario would be that Bibi's Likud party becomes the major party in the coalition, along with the most extreme anti-everything, he says, anti-everything right-wing party, which is a party known as Otzma Yehudit, or Jewish power. Some of you will remember the name of Mayor Kahana. Okay.
I heard him speak.
Yeah, oh, okay. Meir Kahana, the Jewish Defense League,
Yes.
and who led to the infamous Baruch Goldstein, who actually was from Atlanta originally, but in Israel, and he's the one who went down to Hebron and murdered something like 30 Muslims at prayer in Hebron on Purim. And et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But Kahana and his party ran for Knesset. Kahana and his party were banned from running for the Knesset or gleaning any votes. There's always been a small segment of the population that still followed him, but in no way did it represent typical mainstream or even the mainstream of the right. In Israel's politics, until this guy now named Itamar Ben-Gvir, who admittedly is an adherent of Kahana's policies, that not only should Arabs not live in certain areas, but Arabs should be kicked out of the entire country. Racist to the core. And whether or not, because Bibi and Netanyahu has not come out and said he would never allow this guy into the coalition. So, in other words, he's still open to having the racist party. Let's call them that, the Jewish Power Party. He certainly is open to having all of the ultra-Orthodox parties continue to be in control of their different portfolios, if you will. But the interesting question is whether the people to this, let's call it center right, as opposed to Labor being center left, to the center right, and many of them used to be much more on the reactionary side, and they've come more into the center. As they've come closer to the possibilities of being in the government, they've actually come a little bit closer to the center, where most of the country, the population, I don't mean geographically, I mean politically, where most of them are. And so there is a good possibility that Netanyahu will be faced with, if I'm going to try to get 61 votes, do I go to the center-right parties and the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox, or do I go to the Orthodox and the far right parties. So that's what needs to be seen. Okay, so you have status quo is one, you have a bad scenario. Second bad scenario, or even worse scenario, is that Netanyahu may go all the way to the right, to the racist policy, to the Jewish power people, as well as the ultra orthodox. What Ron Kronish calls the least bad scenario. He says it's far from great, but it's better than the other two by far. Would be a coalition that would be that would they would attempt to put together after, if Bibi cannot come up with 61 based on his initial negotiations, and so it would wind up being a center left, if you will, with some votes from the right of center, but it would send him packing, and he would certainly then be indicted and would go into all of that, and the Israelis would deal with his corruption, if you will. So that's what Kronish is talking about. This statement now comes from, as I said, Eric Yaffe, who's an American Reform rabbi, an American observer. He's not a far left guy, an American observer of the Israeli situation, and very much of a pro-Zionist. Eric is fluent in Hebrew, and like I said, he's been on the executive of the World Zionist Organization, the Jewish Agency, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Eric writes, "This is a fateful moment for the Jewish world. In 1975, when the United Nations General Assembly proclaimed that Zionism is racism, Jews everywhere came together to assert that no, it is not. Now, almost a half a century later, there's a guy who's a candidate for the Knesset who spouts racist slogans and justifies them as natural extensions of Zionist and Jewish values. In other words, everything that we fought against in 75 when the United Nations was trying to brand Zionism as racism, and they finally agreed, no, that's not. Now along comes this guy who says, yes, it is, and it should be, right? Thanks to the efforts of Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, that's the guy's name, and his colleagues in the Religious Zionist Party, which is neither religious or Zionist, they seem assured of at least 5 seats in Israel's parliament. It may be too late to prevent their election, but it's not too late for Jews everywhere to join in denying these guys the legitimacy that Netanyahu has shamefully bestowed upon them." Then he goes back into, in this particular article, he goes back into talking about Ben Gvir and connecting him to Kahana and whatever. So these are some of the things that we were looking for. Another guy another name that has become worth looking at is Gideon Sa'ar. Sa'ar was one of Netanyahu's lieutenants for quite a few years. He was one of his proteges in the Likud party. They have since broken, and Sa'ar went and formed his own party, the New Hope Tikva Chadasha, a New Hope party. And there's talk that if they can be, if there's talk that if indeed Rivlin, the president, will ask either Sa'ar or Yair Lapid or Naftali Bennett to see if they can form a government, that those three together and their parties, Sa'ar with New Hope, Yair Lapid, his party is called Yesh Atid, There Is a Future, and then Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, that the three of them working together as the core of an anti-Netanyahu bloc may be able to attract. Labor would certainly go with them. Meretz would certainly go with them. At least one of the Arab parties now would go with them. The kibbutz parties would go with them. So there's kind of a hope that, recognizing that Rivlin had to do what he did, but that if Netanyahu cannot succeed, fingers crossed they're saying, that this would be a logical kind of thing. And both Sa'ar and Lapid have said publicly that if it comes to a sharing between our three parties, that they would even allow and a rotation of a prime minister, which is what Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin had done. That if it meant to a sharing or a rotation of the prime ministership, they were even willing to let Naftali Bennett, who's the most to the right of all of those three parties, to let him be the prime minister first. So they've already started talking about that and talking about it publicly. So there's thinking that may indeed indeed come to pass. Okay. The realities of where we sit right now. Okay. March 31st, the elections committee finished counting the ballots. There weren't too many accusations of voter fraud, just pointing that out. But on March 31st, they presented the results to the president. The president had a few days, and then on April 5th, he began meeting with the leadership of all the parties that had met the threshold, again, of 0.5% of people to get into the Knesset, and to ask them who they would recommend that he give the mandate to form a government with. On April 6th was the actual installation or swearing in of the new members of the Knesset, because they had to be in place to be able to vote on a government with all the ministers, et cetera, and the coalition once it's officially presented. And of course, the sidebar to that is that if at any one time any of the smaller parties or whatever leave the coalition, then immediately there's a vote of no confidence in the parliament and the government falls, and there's new elections that are automatically announced. Okay, so on April 6th, the new members were sworn in, and I told you about Rabbi Gilad Kariv, the Orthodox walked out on him. On April 7th, Rivlin announced that reluctantly, that was his term, reluctantly, he is asking or inviting Netanyahu to form a government, has 28 days. That will take it to May 5th to present the government. He can request an extension. The likelihood, and again, Rivlin has said, unless he hears from others that it's only a matter of one vote, for example, he will not grant Bibi an extension. He's making it very clear he doesn't like the guy. And then if Bibi cannot, if Netanyahu by May 5th cannot come up with a government, then the president has the choice of either giving that opportunity to somebody else, and it would be either Gidon Sa'ar, Yair Lapid, or Naftali Bennett. The question is whether, if the three of them send a message to the president that we think we have a coalition, and this is what the rotation would be, give us a chance. And much of the Israeli population, I can't say a majority, but much of the Israeli population and the people that I speak to and the things that I read are working on the assumption that legitimately will be a possibility. Okay, if the three of them can keep in touch with each other. Yes, Lynn.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to go to another meeting. I just want to say
Okay.
this was really helpful. Thank you for
I
doing
wish I
this.
could be clearer, but it's because it's very
But it's-
complicated.
Yeah,
Good
it
to
was
see
very,
you.
it was very helpful to get an overall picture. So
Okay,
thank you.
good to see you.
And
Thanks. Okay,
Bye.
take care. Say hi to David.
I
All
will.
right. So if, hang on one second. So if Netanyahu cannot reach 61, if he can, then boom, they go to the Knesset. He presents his the order of who's going to be the minister of this, who's going to be the minister of this. Here are the basic outlines of our platform. The parliament, the Knesset goes yay or nay, and then they have a government. If as most people in Israel are assuming, if Netanyahu will not be able to get to 61, that public pressure will, he's already said he will not accept the Arab, this fellow Abbas, by Michael, sorry, that he will not accept this fellow Abbas, who's not a relative of Mohammed Abbas or Mahmoud Abbas, that Netanyahu will not accept him. And he will align more with the racist parties and the ultra-Orthodox, and the majority of the Israeli population is uncomfortable with that. There certainly are people who are in favor or just accepting of it, but the majority polls are all saying that the Israeli population is very uncomfortable with having such a right-wing leaning government. And they're trying to get that message to Netanyahu to see if he'll kind of moderate a little bit. He's got another week or so to determine that, week or 2 weeks to determine that. So Rivlin, if Netanyahu cannot come up with a majority 61, Rivlin, the president, has the choice then of either asking someone else to try, and again, the likelihood is it would be Lapid, Bennett, and Saar, one of the three, or all three together, and they'll create some kind of a new party to run together, or basically say, Dayenu, it's not going to work. We're going to go back and have election number 5. That will be up to the president. And obviously his advisors, and that timetable would be either in either case, 2 to 4 weeks after May 5th. Okay. Yes, Michael.
Yeah, could you offer some examples of the Netanyahu being right-winged, as you stated?
Well, it's not so much of Netanyahu himself, it's the deals that he'd have to make with some of these other very right-wing parties. For example, the one guy that we're talking about, the guy who's the follower of Mayor Kahana, who's saying we're gonna expel all the Arabs from Israel. The ultra-Orthodox parties that are going to say that are going to continue to say that everything in Israel has to be run according to Orthodox law. They're going to, forget about pandemic. They're going to say that everything needs to be closed. When we say the restaurants and the theaters and whatever and the public transportation is going to be closed, when we say so. Standards of dress and clothing are going to become more restrictive. I mean, all these kinds of things that they're saying, so it's not Netanyahu himself necessarily. I'm not familiar with all the planks of his platform. It's the concern that of what he's willing to compromise about, or allow these other groups to have total influence over the government, and it would be the most far right government that Israel has ever seen.
Well, it's also, are the people getting information from some of these news sources that may be slanted without having Netanyahu speak personally on these things? See,
Oh,
I'm listening to you, Rabbi, and getting this one opinion, one point of view, and I don't. There's nobody else to speak on another part, so I'm not clear on getting other points of view, because I'm not like you. I'm not familiar with Israeli politics at all.
Well, I'm trying to be as objective as possible and just presenting the stories as I see them. In preparing for this, I was looking at not only the typical the Haaretz and Times of Israel. Haaretz is definitely left wing, but Times of Israel is centrist. Jerusalem Post is more to the right, if Haaretz is to the left. Been looking to all of those, looking at things that AIPAC has been sending out, and that what I'm going to almost conclude with is with what Axios has been sending out as unedited and unprejudiced news reporting. Okay, how the Israelis choose to get their news, I don't know. I mean, we have people in the United States that say, "Oh, I'm only going to watch MSNBC, or I'm only going to watch Fox, or only going to read the New York Times, or only going to read the Arizona Daily Star." So I don't know. Walperts, I know you've been trying to get in. I saw you out of the corner of my. You're up in my right corner there.
Just say you're the head of our party, and there's like 8 people in the group.
Eight have been elected to the Knesset, you mean?
Yes, 8
Yeah.
have been connected, and you want to join Netanyahu, but I don't.
The party has said at their own convention what they would do under those circumstances. So
Okay.
if I'm the leader of the party, I have direction from my party's convention of how much I can give up, what concessions I can make, or what demands I could make. If Netanyahu, let's say, or it might be Saar or Lapid, if any of one of them comes to me and says, "Listen, we would like the Roman party or the Beth Shalom party, to come into the coalition. What are you looking for? What do you stand for? What would you insist upon?" And so at our previous annual convention or whatever, we would already have those answers set. So somebody who disagreed with those answers, I suppose, probably would not have allowed his or her name to be on the list. I'm surmising. I don't know for sure.
So once you're there and you're one of the 120 votes, it's
Yeah.
really based on a party, not on the individual.
Technically, it's an individual vote. But there's a lot of party regimen. Okay. And block voting, in a sense. Okay. All right. So let me add a few more things here. Axios, as a news reporting agency, here's what they said on March 24th. The one big thing is that the outcome of Israel's election is uncertain. That's a given, and that's typical. They've always been like that. This was written as of 90% of the votes, when the final 10% didn't make much of a difference. Okay, so Prime Minister Netanyahu's right-wing bloc is just short of a 61-seat majority. I think they're at 56 or maybe 57. Breaking it down, a broad no, I'll take that back. Netanyahu's bloc is 51. The anti-Netanyahu bloc, which is loose, I mean, there's no written agreements, but the parties that would list themselves as being, anyone but Netanyahu was the 57. Okay. There was hope that anti-Netanyahu bloc would actually have a majority, but they don't. The results suggest that most Israeli voters want to see Netanyahu removed, but they can't agree on an alternative. Many feel that many are to the left of him, but there are some who are to the right. There are some who don't feel that he's done enough to support the settlers or against Iran or whatever it might be. If the results hold, this will be the fourth time in 2 years that Netanyahu has failed to win enough support to form a stable right-wing government. Likely means Israel's political crisis and Netanyahu's corruption trial will both continue. Again, if Netanyahu, and this is, for some people, this is the most important factor in their voting. They may believe 100% in his policies, but they don't like the guy. And by voting against him would mean that he will have to go to trial. And if he's convicted, would be punished. Israel has already sent a past president to jail. Okay, so there's no question that if Netanyahu does go to jail and if he is convicted, I mean, if he goes to trial and is convicted, he would go to jail. So there are some people who like his policies but don't like the guy. So they voted against him for that reason. I have no way of knowing how many, but there certainly were people like that. Likud is easily the largest party, but again, no one knows what's going to happen. They have the largest party, meaning in a sense of a plurality, but not anywhere near a majority. Okay. There's also one scenario, I forget where I saw this. It wasn't in the mainstream Israeli press, but somebody was trying to work out a deal that that the Likud would be at the center of a new coalition. They would get the majority, and then in a new parliament, the new parliament would pass a law targeting Netanyahu, banning anybody who's under criminal indictment from serving as prime minister. And then, like the number two person, who I'm forgetting the name, the number two person in Likud would automatically take over. So that I don't know whether that's an actually a movement of something that people are trying to promote, or just if that was one newspaper op-ed writer who was suggesting to do that. Okay, so according to Axios, the different and this is what AIPAC has picked up on also. So here are the different scenarios if the current numbers hold. Netanyahu can try to reach a majority, convincing one or two members of a breakaway party like Gideon Sa'ar or some of the other people who used to be Likud members. He can try to convince them to join him. That would be the simplest path. It would be the easiest path. There wouldn't be as much controversy about it. Okay. Second alternative or second scenario is that somehow Netanyahu reaches a deal with this Arab party, the Islamist Ra'am party, with this one leader of their party. Again, his last name is Abbas. That they would support a government led by Likud in return for Likud dropping off from the far right, those the party, the Kahanist type of party, Ben Gvir's party, and if he would leave them aside and try to reach accommodation with the Arab party. Some people feel that Netanyahu has already behind the scenes, because he's very much of a wheeler dealer. He wouldn't be and have been where he is if he wasn't. Some people believe that they've already floated this story, but there are some in just to the right of Netanyahu who said that they won't sit in a government, in a coalition with the Arab party. So he's trying to balance all of these things. Then there's the people who support this Yair Lapid, like I called the Walter Cronkite or the somebody else. And the only way that would succeed is if Gidon Sa'ar and other former Likud people and Naftali Bennett and his rightist party, they'd have to get between 6 and 7 additional seats to be able to have that happen. So what people are saying is that the two characters to watch the most, one, and certain Netanyahu is one, but the other is what's going to happen with this Mansour Abbas, and whether he's legitimate, whether he indeed wants to get into the government to be able to frame a new dialogue, Jewish-Arab dialogue, and of a new role of the Palestinian Authority, so to speak. And then what's going to happen with this guy Ben Gvir? What's going to happen with Naftali Bennett and others? So that's the analysis. Let me give you one more thing. And again, I go back to my friend Eric Yaffe. Said in his mind, as crazy as all of this is, as crazy of all that it all is, there are 3 positives that we have to put there. And I'll end with the 3 positives. One more statement, and then we'll join together in singing Hatikva. Okay. So positive number 1 is, as I mentioned before, Gilad Kariv, the Reform rabbi, who's in the Knesset. I've met him. I don't know him well, but I've met him. I've heard him speak. He's an authentic. He's eloquent. He's committed. He also has a law degree. He's knowledgeable. He will drive the ultra-Orthodox parties crazy. He will absolutely. He's only one person, but he will constantly be raising his voice on issues that reflect the kind of Judaism that most of us, North America, and indeed all over the rest of the world, the kind of pluralistic, accepting, respectful, based on tzedakah, things like that. He will make sure that the Israeli government participates and recognizes and respects those values, rather than some of the crazy, not all of it, but some of the craziness that the ultra-Orthodox throw in there. Second positive is that this may be a new way of looking at long-term positive relationships between Arabs and Jews in the state of Israel. There maybe, we'll see. But if this guy, Mansour Abbas, if he's legitimate, and he seems to be. The third, we don't necessarily hear about this, and I can understand why, because the American press doesn't want to put this out there. The 2021 World Happiness Report ranks Israel number 12 in the entire world out of 149 countries. Israel is number 12. Incidentally, Canada is 14, and the United States is 18.
Who's number
But
one?
despite, pardon me?
Who's number one?
Who's number one? You know what? It doesn't say. It's usually something like Sweden
Right,
or something like
Yeah.
that, right?
right.
Okay. But despite all of this craziness, all of this, as they say, balagan and mishigas, all of this, the Israeli, when questioned, the Israeli says, yeah, there's tourists and whatever, and da, 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 da. But for all intents and purposes, the average Mr. and Mrs. Israeli citizen is happier than the average Mr. and Mrs. American citizen.
Was they confused?
They're confused, and they still sing for peace. Okay.
I have a
Um,
technical question.
Who's asking the technical
David.
question?
David.
David,
What's the impact on the bureaucracy of these constant elections? In other words, does the person like Netanyahu get to choose the cabinet members of the various heads of bureaucracies within the
Right.
country?
Right.
And then if it goes into chaos, how does the leadership of those bureaucracies, how is that impacted?
Well, it depends on whether you're talking of specifically of a political appointment, or whether you're talking about people who are the professional bureaucrats,
Right.
the professionals in the Foreign Service Department or in the Education Department or stuff like that.
The Israelis are still.
We usually only hear about problems when it comes to budgetary issues.
So that
Most of them, at least in my experience, most of those departments, ministries, whatever, continue to function on their own. They continue-
regardless of who the appointee is at the top.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Exactly. Now, there's also something, and I don't want to get into a whole other, because right now there's a whole big controversy about it also. There's the Israeli government, and that's what we've been talking about all morning. Okay? There's also the quasi-Israeli government, which is technically the government of the Jewish people. That's the World Zionist Organization. You might remember a couple of years ago, or a year and a half ago, we were talking about there's a Congress. The World Zionist Congress meets every 5 years in Jerusalem. This year it was on Zoom, obviously, and I was running to be one of the American delegates to that. So that's the quasi-government that has the Jewish National Fund, Karen Kayemet LiYisrael. That falls under that. It's a non-governmental. It's an NGO, but it's a non-governmental, but parallel to the government. The official Israeli government gives it its funding, but is not responsible for the policies that the Jewish National Fund would implement. The agencies that support Jewish education and diaspora. If Beth Shalom Temple Center was running a religious school, for example, we could get a direct subsidy to teach Jewish children from Jerusalem. It may only be 50 cents, but we could get a direct subsidy to teach Jewish children in Green Valley. Okay, and they would provide materials, resources, books, film strips, whatever, videos, whatever we needed. Also, the area of absorption, immigration and absorption, is not part of the Knesset. It's part of the Jewish agency, what's called the Sochnut. So, like if you think of, if we go back to the days of bringing all the Russian immigrants, Okay, back in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, with the fall of the Iron Curtain. If you talk of bringing the Ethiopians, Operation Solomon, that's not parliament, that's the quasi government of through the Jewish agency and whatever. But they still also have representative participation based on party affiliation. The difference is that because it's for a lot of that money is spent in the diaspora, so diaspora communities have delegates and have a voice in how that goes on. Okay, that was the Congress that I was invited to run, to be a delegate to make some decisions about that. How much of their budget would go towards bringing immigrants in, and how much would go towards education, how much would go for sending Israeli youth, or not youth, post-army Israeli volunteers to come to something that I've been always been very involved with, to come and help be staff at Jewish summer camps all around the world, okay, and serve as role models for our Jewish kids to learn one-on-one about Israel that way. So things like that. Okay, I remembered who the fourth voice that I wanted to give you. It's a fellow by the name of Jonathan Dekel-Chen, who's a former American. He's married to a friend of mine. He teaches at Hebrew University, teaches political science, and he focuses more especially on Russia, former Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, if you will. But these were some of his comments, and he's much more right-wing than I am. What can be done in light of this election? I cannot foresee substantive change to Israel's parliamentary system or movement toward a constitution, but there's reason for hope. I'd like to believe that the majority of Jewish Israelis, who, lest we forget, are not ultra-Orthodox and do not reside in the West Bank, they are increasingly coming to grips with the consequences of the morally vacant nature of our national politics. Israelis are forming widening circles of nonprofit groups committed to bridging old ideological and religious divides. They are increasingly marrying across old ethnic divides. Through their global contacts and travels, they encounter the power of diversity. Younger generations are less inclined to absorb the fear and hate-mongering promoted by too many of our politicians, and young Israelis cannot help but be inspired by the global spread of courageous, ground-up social justice and democracy movements. I cannot say when wholly cynical, tribal, transactional, divisive politics will pass from our country. I am confident, however, that it cannot continue much longer. It surely must not. So, Michael gave us the tone at the very beginning. This is all so confusing, so many parties, so much wheeling and dealing and all of this kind of stuff. The new generation is basically saying, no, it really hasn't gotten us to a situation where we're proud enough of who we really want to be. So we're pushing for change. Okay, having said that, I will invite you, if you, I know it's at the back of the book. I don't have the other prayer book in front of me. I do have this one here.
I have a question.
Yeah, Michael, I'm looking for a page. Go ahead.
Yeah. A few minutes ago, you mentioned policy and person. Separate the. They like the people like the policy, but they don't like the person. That's kind of odd for me, because, in my opinion, the policies that one makes that would affect the public would be the most important. They don't like the person for whatever reason. That's that's okay, but the policy is what's important. In other words, if you like somebody, you love somebody so much, but you hate you don't like his policy. That's if you look at it from that point of view, what good is that? You know, you like a person, but he's making policies that are not suitable for the citizens. So how you
Well,
get
that's, I think we're agreeing. That's what I'm saying, is that people are actually looking more, not everybody, but more people that in the past, they've taken it out of the personality worship,
Mhm.
and they're actually starting to, they're separating. They say, we like what Netanyahu has stood for, but we don't like the guy. We don't like the fact that he seems to be corrupt, that he seems to be that he's indicted of all these kinds of things. So they have to balance out how do we vote? How do we support the policies, the statements of the party, but also somehow register the fact that we wish they had a different leader of the party.
Well, when you say so he's under indictment or he's corrupt, was that in his personal life? Does this have to do with his personal life or with his political?
No. Abuse of power when he's been in the government.
Okay. And what is that? I don't even know what that is.
Embezzlement and trying to extort money from newspaper editors so that there'd be stories that would be more supportive of him, things like that. Yeah, no, not personal life, but all within the role of a public servant. Thanks for allowing me to correct it.
This may be a quick arcane thing. So
Yep.
if I have 120 votes and I voted Likud, but I didn't vote for Netanyahu on that, so I voted for the 119 below him,
Right.
and everybody did that.
Technically, you're entitled to do that.
Right, but if everybody did that and Likud did okay, but he individually didn't get very many votes, would he still be there because Likud won?
Probably, my understanding is no. I mean, if let's say that under those circumstances, the number 2 person on the list got more votes, gathered more votes entirely than Likud, than Netanyahu did, I think that by the default, he would be the one that that doesn't automatically make him the head of the party, but it would give the president the president would be asking a different question to all the people that he meets with. He would be saying, okay, so who do you think, recognizing that Netanyahu didn't even get the most votes of all the Likud people. So if all the other parties that he met with said, oh yeah, it'd be a lot easier for us to join a coalition with Likud without Netanyahu. If Yosef Shmuel was the number 2 and he, and if Likud, by having another party convention, if they named him their party leader, so to speak, then probably, but it'd be complicated, but I guess it could work out that way. It sounds very, very strange to us, but that's, right. that's the way it would happen. Okay, so if you do have a copy of the prayer book there, and you wish to join with me, Hatikva is at the bottom of page 374. I'm going to also recite the prayer for the state of Israel. Avinu Sheba Shamayim, Tzur Yisrael v'goalo, Barech et Medinat Yisrael, Reshit Smichat Gulatenu, Hagen Aleha be'avrat chastecha, Ufros Aleho Sukat Shlomecha, Ushlach Orcha v'amitcha, L'rasheha Sareha v'yoatzeha, V'taknem be'etzat tova milfanecha, V'natata Shalom ba'aretz, V'simchat olam liyoshveha v'nomar amen. O heavenly God, protector and redeemer of Israel, bless the state of Israel, which marks the dawning of hope for all who seek peace. Shield it beneath the wings of your love. Spread over it the canopy of your peace. Send your light and truth to all who lead and advise, guiding them with your good counsel. Establish peace in the land and fullness of joy for all who dwell there. And we say, Amen. Kol od balevav pnima nefesh Yehudi homia. Aha. You want your key, Michael? Give us a
Yeah,
key.
can you do it?
Sure, give us a key.
I'll count it off. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Kolod baleva pnima nefesh Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Again,
Thank
Chag
you.
Sameach
Thank
to
you.
everyone. Thank you for being
you.
with. And we look forward to, we'll do a little bit of Yom Ha'atzmaut talk tomorrow night, not much. Shabbat tomorrow night, 5 o'clock.
Yep,
Torah study Saturday morning,
10 o'clock.
10 o'clock. And on and on and on, v'chule, v'chule. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
You sound in
Very
good
nice.
shape, Rabbi. So
I'm doing okay. And the really good news is that we actually got Linda a doctor this week. So that's
Good.
That's even
really
better.
good.
So
Thanks.
call me at some time soon, please.
I will. Thank you.
Please. Okay,
Bye-bye.
thank you. Thank
Okay,
you.
bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.